In recent years, the concept of soul ties has exploded across social media platforms, relationship podcasts, and spiritual guidance forums. TikTok videos with the hashtag soul ties have garnered millions of views, while relationship coaches and spiritual advisors offer programs promising to help people break unhealthy soul ties and heal from spiritual entanglements. This modern phenomenon describes profound connections that seem to transcend ordinary relationships. Bonds so deep they appear to link people at the level of their very essence, their souls. But long before this concept became a trending topic, one of history's most influential psychologists had already mapped the territory of these powerful psychological connections. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who broke from Freud to forge his own path in depth psychology, spent decades investigating the mysterious ways humans become psychologically entangled with one another. While Jung never used the term soul ties specifically, his extensive work on projection, psychological complexes, and the unconscious mind provides a fascinating framework for understanding these powerful connections. Jung's analytical psychology represents one of the most comprehensive attempts to map the human psyche in all its complexity. Where Freud focused primarily on repressed sexual desires, Jung expanded the territory to include spiritual dimensions, collective patterns of thought, and the profound ways our unconscious minds shape our connections with others. His concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, psychological projection, and the shadow self continue to influence fields ranging from psychology and literature to religion and popular culture. What makes Jung's work particularly relevant to our discussion is that he recognized and warned about the powerful unconscious forces that can bind people together in ways that modern discourse might label as soul ties. Through his clinical work and his own intense relationships, Jung understood that human connections could involve far more than conscious attraction or compatibility. They could entangle people at the level of the unconscious mind, creating bonds that were difficult to break and sometimes psychologically harmful. This video explores how Jung's psychological insights anticipated today's discussions of soul ties, offering both a deeper understanding of these connections and important cautions about their potential dangers. While modern influencers may present soul ties as either purely spiritual blessings or curses to be broken, Jung's nuanced approach reveals a more complex reality: that our deepest connections reflect both conscious and unconscious elements of ourselves, carrying both transformative potential and a psychological risk. So what exactly are soul ties as understood in contemporary discourse? The term generally refers to a profound emotional, spiritual, or energetic connection between two people that persists beyond ordinary relationship boundaries. These connections are often described as feeling as though a piece of yourself remains with the other person even after the relationship ends. The concept suggests that intimate interactions, particularly sexual ones, create invisible bonds that continue to influence thoughts, emotions, and behaviors long after physical separation. The idea has roots in various religious traditions, particularly certain interpretations of biblical passages that speak of two becoming one flesh. However, the concept has expanded far beyond religious contexts to become a staple of relationship discourse across spiritual and secular communities alike. Relationship coaches speak of unhealthy soul ties that keep people emotionally trapped in toxic relationships. Spiritual healers offer rituals to cut cords or break ties that purportedly drain energy and prevent moving forward. Self-help authors write about the need to detox from past relationships by addressing these spiritual connections. The popularity of this concept reflects very real psychological experiences. Many people report feeling inexplicably drawn to former partners, experiencing intrusive thoughts about past relationships, or struggling to fully engage in new connections because they feel somehow still bound to previous ones. These experiences suggest that something meaningful is happening psychologically, even if the spiritual framing of soul ties represents just one interpretive lens. From a contemporary psychological perspective, these experiences might be explained through attachment theory, trauma bonding, or emotional conditioning. Neuroscience points to the ways intimate relationships create neural pathways that associate specific people with reward, comfort, or arousal. When relationships end, these pathways don't immediately disappear, creating lingering psychological connections that can feel almost mystical in their persistence. Where pop psychology often oversimplifies these bonds as either wholly positive, twin flames, or soulmates, or entirely negative, toxic attachments to be severed. More rigorous psychological understanding recognizes their complexity. Emotional bonds serve important evolutionary and developmental functions, helping us form the attachments necessary for survival and psychological health. Yet they can also become maladaptive, keeping us psychologically tethered to harmful relationships or preventing healthy autonomy. This is where Jung's work becomes particularly valuable. Rather than reducing these connections to simple categories of good or bad, Jung's analytical psychology offers a framework for understanding them as complex manifestations of both conscious and unconscious processes. Processes that can be both psychologically transformative and potentially dangerous when left unexamined. To understand Jung's perspective on what we now call soul ties, we must first grasp several key concepts that form the foundation of his psychological framework. At the heart of Jung's psychology lies the collective unconscious, a layer of the unconscious mind shared by all humans across cultures and time periods. Unlike Freud's personal unconscious, which contains repressed memories and desires specific to the individual, Jung's collective unconscious houses universal patterns and images he called archetypes. These include fundamental human patterns like the mother, the hero, the shadow, and crucially for our discussion of soul ties, the anima and animus. The anima represents the unconscious feminine side of a man, while the animus represents the unconscious masculine side of a woman. Jung believed these inner images profoundly influence our attractions and relationships. When we feel an overwhelming, almost magical attraction to someone, Jung would suggest we are often projecting our anima or animus onto that person. The person seems to embody our unconscious ideal, creating a powerful psychological pull that feels destined or fated. Projection, Jung wrote, is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. This process happens largely outside our awareness. We unconsciously project parts of ourselves, particularly parts we don't recognize or accept, onto others. When these projections are positive, they create feelings of profound connection, fascination, and even obsession. The other person seems to complete us because they appear to embody qualities we unconsciously sense within ourselves but haven't yet integrated into conscious awareness. Jung observed that these projections create a psychological condition he called participation mystique, a term borrowed from anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl. This describes a state where psychological boundaries between people become blurred, creating a sense of mystical or magical connection. Jung wrote, "Participation mystique means a peculiar kind of psychological connection with objects wherein the subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it by a direct relationship which amounts to partial identity. This partial identity with another person describes precisely what many today call a soul tie, a connection where psychological boundaries blur and another person seems to carry parts of your identity or essence." Jung also introduced the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by conventional causality, but seem to reflect a connection between inner psychological states and outer events. Many who speak of soul ties describe precisely such experiences, thinking of someone moments before they call, dreaming about them on significant dates, or encountering symbols that remind them of the relationship at seemingly meaningful moments. Perhaps most importantly for understanding soul ties, Jung developed the concept of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we repress, deny, or fail to recognize. The shadow contains not only negative qualities we reject, but also positive potential we haven't yet realized. When we form intense connections with others, Jung believed these shadow elements play a crucial role. We are often drawn to people who embody our disowned qualities, creating relationships that feel destined but may actually represent encounters with our own unintegrated psychological material. These foundational concepts, projection, anima/animus, participation mystique, synchronicity, and shadow, provide the theoretical groundwork for understanding Jung's implicit warnings about what modern discourse calls soul ties. While Jung never specifically addressed soul ties by that name, his writings contain numerous warnings about the psychological dynamics underlying these powerful connections. In his clinical work, Jung repeatedly observed the dangers of unconscious entanglements, particularly when projection dominated relationships. Where love rules, Jung wrote, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, their love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other. This observation points to a central warning about intense connections. When unconscious forces drive relationships, they often create unhealthy power dynamics disguised as love or spiritual connection. Jung was particularly concerned about projection-dominated relationships. In his essay, Marriage as a Psychological Relationship, he warned, if we are to develop our personalities, we need to be clear about ourselves. But we cannot accomplish this task if we persist in the illusion that the other person is responsible for our emotions, which we then project onto them. When we mistake projection for genuine connection, as often happens in what are now called soul ties, we create relationships built on illusion rather than authentic engagement with another person. The anima and animus projections particularly concerned Jung because of their numinous, almost religious quality. When someone appears to embody our inner feminine or masculine ideal, the attraction feels cosmic and fated. Jung cautioned, the projection-making factor is the anima, or rather the unconscious as represented by the anima. These projections create what he called emotional entanglements that bind people together through unconscious rather than conscious forces. Jung elaborated on these entanglements in his concept of psychological complexes, emotionally charged groups of ideas that behave somewhat autonomously within the psyche. When our complexes become activated in relationships, they create powerful emotional responses that feel beyond our control. As Jung put it, complexes are psychic fragments which have split off due to traumatic influences or certain incompatible tendencies. These psychological fragments can become attached to perceptions of other people, creating precisely the kind of persistent emotional bonds described as soul ties in The Psychology of the Transference. Jung analyzed the alchemical imagery of Konyangsho, the mystical union or joining of opposites, as a metaphor for psychological entanglement. While he recognized the transformative potential of such unions, he also warned, the purpose of the opus psychological work is not to go on indefinitely making conjunctions, but to produce out of the multiplicity of units a unity that includes and organizes them all. In other words, healthy psychological development requires integrating these powerful connections rather than remaining trapped in unconscious entanglements. Perhaps Jung's most explicit warning about what we might now call unhealthy soul ties comes from his observations about identification, a psychological state where boundaries between self and other dissolve. He wrote, identification with one's office or one's title is very attractive. The results of identification are usually catastrophic, as the individual loses himself and becomes his own less than human persona. Similarly, identification with another person through unconscious projection leads to a loss of self, creating relationships that feel destined but actually impede individual development. Jung's collected works contain numerous passages that sound remarkably like descriptions of unhealthy soul ties. An unconscious relationship is a veritable hell, as anyone can tell you who has experienced it. What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate, and the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. These statements suggest that what many experience as fated connections or soul ties may actually represent unconscious psychological material manifesting in relationships. Through these various writings, Jung consistently warned about the dangers of unconscious connections that create psychological enmeshment rather than genuine relationship. While he never used the term soul ties, his work offers perhaps the most comprehensive psychological framework for understanding and approaching with caution these powerful bonds. To better understand how Jung's concepts apply to what we now call soul ties, let's examine several archetypal relationship scenarios through a Jungian lens. Consider first the case of intense romantic obsession following a brief but powerful connection. Sarah, a 32-year-old professional, meets Michael at a friend's gathering. Though they spend only one evening together, she feels an instant, almost supernatural connection, as if they've known each other in another life. Despite minimal contact afterward, Sarah finds herself constantly thinking about Michael, dreaming about him, and feeling his presence even when he's not there. She describes feeling that a piece of my soul is connected to his and cannot seem to move on despite rational understanding that they barely know each other. From a Jungian perspective, this classic scenario likely represents animus projection. Jung would suggest that Sarah has projected her own internal masculine archetype onto Michael, who for various reasons, appearance, mannerisms, qualities, provided a suitable hook for this projection. What Sarah experiences as a soul tie is actually an encounter with her own unconscious masculine aspects. The intensity feels supernatural precisely because it activates archetypal material from the collective unconscious, creating what Jung called participation mystique, a blurring of psychological boundaries that feels mystical. Jung would caution that this type of connection, while potentially initiating important psychological growth, becomes problematic when mistaken for genuine relationship. As he wrote, "The projection of the animus on a real man endows him with unreal glamour and significance." The danger lies in Sarah remaining fixated on Michael rather than recognizing the projection and integrating these masculine qualities into her own consciousness. Now consider a different scenario: the inexplicable negative bond that persists after a toxic relationship. James, a 40-year-old teacher, ended a 3-year relationship with Rebecca after recognizing patterns of manipulation and emotional abuse. Yet despite understanding the relationship's harmful nature, James continues feeling mysteriously drawn back to Rebecca. He describes feeling energetically tied to her and experiences anxiety, intrusive thoughts, and emotional turmoil when attempting to cut contact completely. Through a Jungian lens, this scenario likely involves shadow projection and complex activation. Jung would suggest that James projected disowned aspects of his own shadow onto Rebecca, creating a powerful unconscious bond. Additionally, the relationship likely activated early attachment complexes, creating emotional patterns that operate autonomously below conscious awareness. What James experiences as a soul tie represents unintegrated psychological material seeking recognition and healing. Modern discourse about soul ties might suggest James needs a spiritual ritual to cut the cord. Jung would propose a different approach: conscious integration of the projected material. As Jung stated, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Rather than trying to sever the connection, Jung would encourage James to understand what this relationship reveals about his own unconscious, particularly his shadow aspects and unresolved complexes. That a third scenario involves synchronistic connections that persist between former partners. Elena and David ended their relationship amicably years ago, but continue experiencing uncanny coincidences, dreaming about each other on the same nights, thinking of each other moments before unexpected contact, or encountering meaningful symbols that remind them of their connection. They describe feeling spiritually connected beyond explanation, despite having moved on to other relationships. Jung would likely interpret this through his concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reflect connections between psychic and physical events. Rather than seeing these experiences as evidence of literal soul ties, Jung might suggest they reflect a continuing process of psychological integration catalyzed by the relationship. The synchronicities serve as meaningful signposts in both individuals' individuation journeys, pointing towards psychological material still seeking integration that I in all three scenarios. What contemporary discourse labels as soul ties represents, from a Jungian perspective, encounters with unconscious psychological material through the medium of relationship. While modern interpretations often focus on severing these connections, Jung's approach emphasizes conscious integration of the projected material, transforming unconscious entanglement into psychological growth. Jung's concept of the shadow offers particular insight into the potentially dangerous aspects of what we now call soul ties. The shadow contains not only negative qualities we reject, but also positive potentials we haven't realized. In relationships, Jung observed that shadow material plays a crucial role in creating powerful unconscious bonds, both constructive and destructive. The shadow, Jung wrote, is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. This challenge becomes especially acute in intense relationships where shadow material is exchanged between partners. Jung observed that in close relationships, particularly romantic ones, people often unconsciously trade shadow projections, each person carrying disowned aspects of the other's psyche. This psychological exchange creates precisely the kind of deep entanglement described as soul ties. When someone carries your projected shadow, they hold power over you because they embody parts of yourself you haven't integrated. Jung noted, if you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all his projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. Such a man has saddled himself with new problems and conflicts. He has become a serious problem to himself. The most dangerous aspect of these shadow-based connections is their tendency to create compulsive patterns. Jung observed that unintegrated shadow material manifests as compulsive behavior, precisely the kind of inexplicable pull many experience in what they call soul ties. As Jung put it, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Many who describe feeling fated to return to certain relationships are experiencing precisely this dynamic, unconscious shadow material directing their behavior. Jung identified several psychological dangers in these unconscious entanglements. First, they prevent individuation, the process of becoming a psychologically integrated individual. When we remain bound to others through projection, we cannot fully develop our own potential. Second, they create what Jung called psychic infection, the unconscious transmission of psychological material between people. This explains why those in intense relationships often take on each other's emotional states, thought patterns, or even physical symptoms. Perhaps most importantly, Jung recognized that unconscious connections create fertile ground for what modern psychology calls trauma bonding. When shadow projection combines with trauma activation, it creates particularly tenacious bonds that feel spiritual or fated, but actually represent unhealed psychological wounds. As Jung observed, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Many soul ties that persist after harmful relationships reflect precisely this dynamic. Internal trauma patterns manifesting as seemingly external bonds. These Jungian insights align remarkably well with contemporary understanding of trauma bonding and codependency. Modern trauma psychology recognizes that intense attachment can form in response to intermittent reinforcement, power imbalances, and shared traumatic experiences, creating bonds that persist despite their harmful nature. What Jung adds to this understanding is recognition of the shadow's role in cementing these connections at an unconscious level that Jung's framework helps explain why conventional advice to just move on often fails with soul ties. When unconscious material drives the connection, conscious decisions alone cannot resolve it. As Jung wrote, emotions are involuntary. At the moment they come, you can't help it. This involuntary quality of emotionally charged complexes explains why soul ties feel beyond conscious control, because the driving forces operate largely in the unconscious mind. If Jung never used the term soul ties, how might he have approached healing these powerful unconscious connections? His extensive writings on psychological integration provide a framework quite different from modern approaches that focus on cutting cords or performing rituals to break ties. For Jung, genuine healing required bringing unconscious material into consciousness through a process he called individuation. There is no birth of consciousness without pain, Jung wrote. Rather than trying to sever connections, Jung would encourage examining them as valuable sources of information about one's own unconscious. The first step in Jung's approach involves recognizing projections. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face, he observed. Healing begins with the difficult work of withdrawing these projections, recognizing that qualities we attribute to others often belong to disowned aspects of ourselves. In the context of soul ties, this means acknowledging that the seemingly magical connection may actually represent an encounter with our own unintegrated psychological material. Jung developed several techniques for this work of projection, withdrawal, and integration. Active imagination, a method of engaging with unconscious content through dialogue, visualization, or creative expression, allows individuals to consciously engage with the psychological material underlying intense connections. The confrontation with the unconscious must become a conscious experience, Jung insisted. Through active imagination, a person might engage in imaginal dialogue with the figure to whom they feel tied, gradually distinguishing between the actual person and the projected psychological content. Dream analysis represented another core technique in Jung's approach. He considered dreams the direct expression of the unconscious psychic activity, offering valuable insight into the complexes and projections driving persistent connections. Someone working to understand a soul tie might pay particular attention to dreams featuring the person to whom they feel connected, looking for symbols and patterns that reveal the unconscious basis of the bond. Jung also emphasized the importance of symbol work. A symbol is the best possible expression for an unconscious content whose nature can only be guessed, he wrote. Working with the symbols that emerge around intense connections, whether in dreams, synchronicities, or emotional responses, helps integrate the unconscious material they represent. Rather than performing rituals to cut ties, Jung would suggest exploring the symbolic meaning of the connection itself. Crucially, Jung's approach differs from modern soul-tie discourse in its goal. Where contemporary approaches often aim at severing connections, Jung aimed at integration, transforming unconscious entanglement into conscious relationship with both oneself and others. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents, Jung observed. Similarly, the greatest burden in intense relationships is the projected, unintegrated aspects of oneself. Healing comes not from cutting ties, but from reclaiming these projections. Modern therapeutic approaches align with Jung's perspective in several ways. Contemporary trauma therapy recognizes that persistent emotional bonds often reflect attachment patterns and trauma responses rather than spiritual connections. Internal family systems therapy works with parts of the self that become entangled with others, similar to Jung's complexes. Mindfulness-based approaches help individuals distinguish between thoughts, emotions, and sensations that originate internally versus those attributed to connections with others. Where Jung's approach differs most significantly is in its recognition of the archetypal and collective dimensions of these bonds. Rather than reducing intense connections to personal psychology alone, Jung acknowledged their roots in the collective unconscious and their potential role in psychological development. As he wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls." The pain of soul ties may represent precisely this difficult birth of greater consciousness. Long before soul ties became a trending topic, Carl Jung had mapped the territory of these powerful psychological connections with remarkable insight. His concepts of projection, the shadow, anima/animus, and participation mystique provide a sophisticated framework for understanding why certain relationships feel so mystically significant and why their influence persists beyond physical separation. Jung's warnings about these unconscious entanglements remain profoundly relevant today. Where modern discourse often presents soul ties as either entirely spiritual phenomena or simple psychological attachments to be broken, Jung recognized their complexity as manifestations of both personal and collective unconscious material. He understood that these connections could be both transformative and dangerous, potentially catalyzing psychological growth or trapping individuals in compulsive patterns driven by unintegrated shadow aspects. Perhaps Jung's most valuable contribution to our understanding of soul ties lies in his approach to healing. Rather than attempting to sever these connections through rituals or declarations, Jung emphasized the importance of conscious integration, withdrawing projections, recognizing shadow material, and incorporating the lessons of these powerful bonds into one's own psychological development. As he wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." The wisdom in Jung's approach lies in its recognition that soul ties, rather than external connections to be broken, represent encounters with parts of ourselves seeking integration. The very intensity of these bonds signals their psychological significance. They persist because they carry important unconscious material requiring attention and integration. The balanced perspective, informed by Jung's insights, neither dismisses soul ties as mere superstition nor accepts them uncritically as spiritual facts. Instead, it recognizes them as complex psychological phenomena with both personal and collective dimensions, potentially serving either psychological growth or stagnation, depending on how consciously they are approached. As we navigate relationships in an era increasingly interested in spiritual and energetic connections, Jung's work invites a crucial question. What might our most powerful bonds, whether labeled as soul ties or not, reveal about our own unconscious minds? And how might conscious engagement with these connections transform unconscious entanglement into genuine psychological integration and authentic relationship? In the end, Jung's implicit warnings about soul ties contain not just caution, but profound opportunity. The opportunity to transform our most challenging connections into doorways to greater self-knowledge and psychological wholeness.